This is Wendy Muse, your host for the Left Pocket Project podcast. In this, the third episode of the podcast, I'm joined by Lauren Lefty. Lauren is a doctoral candidate at New York University in the history of education. Before beginning doctoral studies in history, Lauren worked as a middle and high school teacher in Texas and New York, and as a policy planner with the New York City Department of Education. Lauren's dissertation, entitled Seize the Schools, que Viva Puerto Rico Libre, Cold War Education Politics in New York and San Juan, has received support from the National Academy of Education and the Spencer Foundation Fellowship. Lauren and I discuss her research on Puerto Rico and labor and education movements both on the island and among diasporic Puerto Rican communities on the mainland. We also chat about Puerto Rico in the present, and how movements throughout the island have worked not only to fight austerity and the continued economic onslaught from D.C., but how people across the island have been fighting to restore some semblance of the lives they once knew. Today I'm speaking with Lauren Lefty, who is a PhD candidate at NYU. And it's great because Lauren Lefty and I are sort of in a competition of who has the best last name. While mine is useful for other purposes, I think for the sake of discussing leftists of color and leftism in general, Lauren Lefty is rather fitting, I think. What do you think?
Well, I do try and live up to my namesake, yes.
This is very good.
In my academics and my politics. But
awesome.
Yes, I always get lots of comments that it's a very memorable and fitting last name.
Of course. And it's fitting that, again, your politics and your academic work at least combines and goes with your last name. I would hate to see if you were a right-wing reactionary with a last name like that. It would be...
Oh, it would be terrible.
Rather misfortunate. So I wanted to have you on to talk a bit about your work because from the best of my recollection, as we are technically in the same cohort at NYU, you've done a lot of work with regard to Puerto Rican student movements in New York, and considering the very recent sort of recovery of a lot of left-wing movements led by people of color, such as the Black Panthers and, many Latino groups of the same sort, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about this history, your research, and sort of what it means to us today to look back on some of these movements and how they can inform our current day politics.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for having me on. I'm so excited to talk about this. And so with my research, it's a transnational history of education politics in New York and Puerto Rico during the Cold War. So I'm looking at roughly the era between 1948 and 1975. And I'm really trying to do a couple of things with this research. And one is to really think about how education policy and activism developed within a border-crossing manner in the context of not just domestic or local politics, but really global political dynamics. And so, for example, I think about how Cold War era foreign aid and development and modernization theory in turn came to influence Great Society War and Poverty educational policies directed towards communities of color in the United States. So that's sort of at the policy-making level, but I'm also, as you mentioned, really thinking about how grassroots activism was likewise influenced by these border-crossing phenomena, and particularly the anti-imperial, global decolonization politics of that era. And Puerto Rico becomes really important in this story, both because it was, this quote-unquote laboratory of democracy and capitalist development during the Cold War, and, its development program just has the perfect name, which is Operation Bootstrap, which I think just really, captures this, capitalist meritocratic ethos so well. But then, they came to be this foil to Cuba and the Caribbean as an economic development model, and they exported a lot of policies to broader Latin America and the global South. And then, again, those policies were used towards Puerto Rican and other communities of color in the U.S. And Puerto Ricans, you have to consider, the ways in which they promoted and embraced some of these, capitalist imperial policies, but also really fought back. I mean, Puerto Ricans were at the vanguard of a lot of anti-imperial politics and organizing, kind of across the hemisphere, but also in New York City. And this directly translated to education politics, and particularly things around, the ESCA and the Great Society, the movement of community-controlled schools and bilingual and bicultural education. So what I really want people to do, as you mentioned in your question, is think about the ways in which, education, we think of it as something so local, even at the neighborhood level, but the ways in which it engages these, global political dynamics. And in our current moment, that definitely has to do with, global ideologies of neoliberalism and anti-neoliberalism and austerity.
Mm-hmm. So speaking of neoliberalism, I want to hear a little bit more about this Operation Bootstrap.
Yes.
Can you describe that a little bit more and how that involves Puerto Rico? And in particular, as you mentioned, Puerto Rico was sort of set up to be, by the U.S., a foil to Cuba. So if you could talk a bit about the intersections between Operation Bootstrap and some of the other operations that were going on by the U.S. in Latin America and where Puerto Rico fits in with this.
Yeah, absolutely. So Operation Bootstrap really grew out of, during the 1930s, a lot of New Dealers came to Puerto Rico in the 1940s as sort of, in the post-war period in the mainland in the 40s. The mainland became this place of prosperity, the economics of prosperity, and a lot of New Deal social programs weren't embraced and accepted anymore. And so a lot of New Dealers went to Puerto Rico self-describing it as this laboratory where they could experiment with sort of state-led planning and development and liberalism. And what that turned into by the 1950s in this era of, McCarthyist repression and extreme anti-communism was even sort of this ramped up pro-capitalist development scheme, which definitely embraced some New Deal, programs, top-down planning, industrialization, some light agricultural reform, but also really incentivizing capital from the mainland to invest in Puerto Rico. And so they offered tax incentives to spur capitalist development, industrialization, urbanization. And this, in terms of education, this really involved the massive investment in the education system for the purposes of capitalist development. So preparing, the engineers and the good workers that would work in the factories that developed. And so this Operation Bootstrap became exactly this model that Puerto Rican, the colonial elite wanted to export it and become important actors in the Cold War. But the State Department, loved this and promoted it as well. So eventually Operation Bootstrap became sort of embedded into the DNA of the Alliance for Progress, which, if you don't know, is the major U.S.-sponsored development aid program in Latin America starting in the early 1960s under JFK. And so, Bootstrap's DNA really became embedded in that. You have thousands of people from Latin America and the global South visiting Puerto Rico in the 50s and the 60s, kind of on these development aid field trips, which is really interesting. Yeah. And then the idea was to, take these ideas and, this is liberalism's answer to communism. This is how we do development right. And so, fascinating in that way.
What were was there a specific set of countries that went to Puerto Rico to sort of learn from these programs, or was it just sort of everyone from all parts of Latin America that went to Puerto Rico to sort of see it in action?
Mm-hmm. It's kind of amazing the breadth of countries that went there. You'll see people from India, from Vietnam, the Philippines, kind of all over the world. I found in the archives this great picture of the Secretary of State of Puerto Rico with lines on a map connecting all the countries that went there. And it really is global, but at the same time, they really were arguing that, well, we are capitalist development within a, quote unquote, Hispanic tradition. And so they, and we speak Spanish. And so they were trying to court Latin American planners, leaders, development economists, engineers, etc. And so after a while, and especially in the 60s, the majority are coming from Latin American countries and all over, Central America, the Southern Cone, Brazil, Colombia, Peru, pretty much everywhere.
And what does it mean, or at least what did it mean for the Puerto Rican elite to engage in a sort of specifically Hispanic essentialist idea of capitalism and development? For them, what does that mean exactly?
And this becomes a really interesting part of the story because they were, on one hand, really embracing the capitalist mantra and development mantras of modernization theorists. And at the same time, they were sort of trying to negotiate this imperial discourse and push for, Puerto Rican cultural nationalism. I mean, they kind of thought of themselves in this way almost as anti-imperialists, which becomes really interesting. But they were saying, a lot of the modernization theory coming out in the 50s and 60s was arguing that modernization couldn't happen in countries that had these traditional attitudes and mindsets. And there's a lot of really offensive, derogatory language coming out of these, academic treatises about Hispanic culture. And so obviously the Puerto Rican elite were really pushing back against this and saying, no, we have this, amazing, vibrant culture. Modernization can happen within Puerto Rican culture. And it was a very sort of essentialist Hispanic definition of that culture, elitist. And, while they did have discourses of we seamlessly blend European, African, and indigenous, histories, it definitely put on a pedestal more white European Hispanic cultural definitions of that.
Right. Was there any sort of involvement as well? I guess I'm sure there was involvement, but I'm wondering with regard to the kickbacks that you mentioned and sort of the incentives for investment, were a lot of those going to U.S. investors, or was it mainly situated in Puerto Rico itself?
That's a good question. So they were really trying to attract mainland businesses and investors. But the Puerto Rican elite were still benefiting from this. So this is sort of that question of, why were they doing this? What was in it for them? And a lot of the government that was in power, the political party, did have really close ties with a lot of mainland businesses. Puerto Rican businesses were benefiting, though the vast majority were mainland businesses. Mm-hmm. Then, of course, the problem with that is, after a while, the tax incentives ran out. Those companies left, leaving the island without a lot of jobs.
And around what time was this when they start pulling out of the island?
This was in the 1970s. So, as I say in my research, the bootstrap kind of begins to break, like mid-60s, late 60s, early 70s, and that's when you have increasing calls for independence, and you hear much more critical language against bootstrap, both on the island and the mainland. Critiques were really strong in the diaspora as well. But the factories really start pulling out in the 70s, and then you see a similar cycle more recently where they tried to, do very similar things, giving tax incentives to these companies, but then they expire, the companies leave, and then a lot of Puerto Ricans are left without jobs.
Right. So this is a great segue, actually, to think about what's going on the island and in New York and the United States, especially on the Puerto Rican left. So I know around the 60s and 70s, you start to see the emergence of a lot of independence movements, some of which are actually armed and Marxist-aligned. So if you could talk a little bit about the local responses on the Puerto Rican level to these sort of neoliberal or the beginnings of what we would now call neoliberal measures on the island, and also what were sort of the reverberations of these movements on the island in New York?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. So exactly, in the late 60s and the 70s, one activist said, quote, nationalism really hit the Puerto Rican community like a club on the head. And you're just seeing all of these organizations and movements springing up that have an explicitly Marxist and or socialist political persuasion, and that are also, fighting for the independence of Puerto Rico. Mm-hmm. And so, as you mentioned, this becomes anything from, student university groups to armed movements on the island. And they became really kind of powerful and influential movements, and they influenced what was happening on the mainland as well. And so mainland Puerto Ricans in the diaspora were also being influenced by rising currents of Black nationalism. So it was kind of this amazing perfect storm of, Black nationalism meeting with island-based Puerto Rican pro-independence, anti-imperialist movements within the context of this global anti-imperial kind of wave spreading the global South. And so, there was a lot of movement between mainland activists to the island and vice versa. It was relatively cheap to fly back and forth, by the 60s and the 70s. Mm-hmm. The Young Lords, which are kind of the most famous, probably, Puerto Rican nationalist organization in New York, they end up opening offices and having a San Juan branch of their organization. But at the same time, this also leads to some tension. Sometimes island and mainland, goals came into conflict with each other. They didn't always agree. The diaspora, especially if you were born in New York as opposed to the island, there were some tensions about, who should really be in charge and directing and leading the independence movement. But at the same time, it really influenced everything from education politics, definitely, but labor movements, housing, fair housing movements, healthcare, just a kind of the broad array of social movements going on in that era.
Right. So that was a lot in one big go here. I want to kind of take apart. No, but I appreciate that. I want to take apart though some of your response and think about them as more microcosmic examinations, right? Mm-hmm. So the first of these that I wanted to hear a little bit more about is you said that there were tensions between activists on the mainland in the United States and activists in Puerto Rico. Could you talk a little bit about what, you mentioned there was a question a bit about the leadership, who should lead if there were to be an independent Puerto Rico, or who should lead these movements. Could you talk a bit more about the tensions, how they arose, and what was, if anything, sort of the main crux of the conflict?
Yeah, and it's interesting. So, in the diaspora, I think nationalism could take on many meanings. And for island-based pro-independence groups, it really meant the political independence of the island of Puerto Rico. It would become its own independent nation. And a lot of diasporic groups were also arguing for that, and others were arguing more for cultural nationalism within the context that they grew up in. Many young lords, for example, were born in New York or Chicago or Philadelphia. They didn't really see themselves and their families moving back to the island, though there was reverse migration at the time. So what they were arguing more was, let's have self-determination within our communities, within U.S. cities, within that political system. And that, led to some tension between the groups. And there were also some interesting tensions about racial justice, actually. So a lot of mainland Puerto Ricans absolutely included racial equality, justice, Black nationalism into their arguments. And on the island, sometimes those were seen as imports from the mainland, not necessarily, the more class-based, movements that had been going on for a while on the island.
Right. But it's interesting because you see with groups like the Young Lords and the Black Panthers, there's quite a bit of a class analysis and aspect of their work, right?
Absolutely.
So is it a matter of the Young Lords focusing more on the racial aspect or at least in their sort of public appearance, right? The way things sort of looked on the outside, it seemed to be, as you said, more of a cultural nationalism movement. But at the center of their work, there's a lot of class-based work as well, right? So
absolutely. Mm-hmm.
So how did that sort of? I'm curious about was it just that the racial aspects or the cultural aspects were alienating for some on the island, or was it a little bit even deeper than that?
Well, I think you really hit the nail on the head. If you look at the Young Lords' political ideology, class and an explicitly socialist and Marxist-influenced ideology is at the heart of what they're arguing for. They do not kind of separate race from class.
Right.
And so I think sometimes it was just a misinterpretation. Sometimes it was just kind of personalities and something, we think of, when we study left-wing movements, sometimes it's just about, the Young Lords were young mainly, and they sometimes came to the island with, kind of arrogant attitudes about they should be in charge and just would rub island activists the same, the wrong way.
Right.
And then sometimes it would be about, more granular disputes within leftist politics. The Young Lords, some branches became more Maoist, in the 70s, and some island-based groups didn't. And so it became about ideology as well as personality, I think.
And this office that you mentioned that the Young Lords opened up in Puerto Rico, was it run by someone from Puerto Rico, or was it run by a mainland-based Young Lord activist who went back and forth, or both?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I know that New York-based Young Lords did go there, and I'm not quite sure who ended up being, the head of that organization, if there was a head at all. I know they did try and work with, on-the-ground activists in San Juan, but I also know that Young Lords, in retrospect, when they wrote their memoirs, they're saying, this was actually kind of a mistake of our organization. We should have maybe tried to just align with existing groups that were already there, which they were doing as well, to be fair. But yeah, I think they didn't quite, cultivate exactly a more local leadership branch of that organization, though I'm not quite an expert of who was totally in charge there.
So on that note a bit, because you said that there were ongoing movements, right? There were multiple movements from multiple sectors of Puerto Rican society that were happening at the same time as the groups like the Young Lords were coming into activism, right? And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about those as well, especially the labor movements. I'm really fascinated by this, particularly as Operation Bootstraps and most likely other initiatives that the United States mainland had launched would involve obviously an expansion of the workforce. So what was going on in the labor movement, and especially in the 60s and 70s in Puerto Rico?
Yeah, the labor movement was really important in this whole story. So there was a very strong labor movement in the 1930s, particularly with kind of the start of the rise of industrialization. Tobacco's workers' unions were very strong, as well as a few others. And in the diaspora as well, in New York, the radical labor movement amongst the Puerto Rican community was extremely strong at this point. But during this era, you also start to see state repression towards these movements, and it was aligned to the growing nationalist movement as well. And so the FBI, the Puerto Rican state, starts cracking down on labor radicalism for its own purposes, because their government was anti-communist, but also because it's thought to be linked to Albizu Campos's growing nationalist movement. Pedro Albizu Campos was the leading nationalist voice at the time. And even in the 30s, the island and mainland discourses about labor, anti-capitalist organizing was really linked as well. And so my expertise is a little bit more with the teachers union, which has always been a really active voice on the island. And so once you get into the bootstrap phase, you see the teachers union having a really important voice. But for the most part, they did embrace bootstrap policies. But again, this was in the context of repression, and specifically something called the gag law, which was passed and made illegal any speaking out against the Commonwealth. Anything pro-independence was banned. And again, because the intersection of independence movements and radical leftist politics critiquing capitalism were so intertwined, it really limited radical dissent on the island as well.
So speaking of teachers, and especially education, since that's the main focus of your work, right?
Yep.
Can you talk a bit more about how all of these sort of competing economic, social, international interests, how that affected education in Puerto Rico, first of all, and again, where that, how did that connect back to the movements that we're seeing in New York? You'd mentioned earlier that there was quite a bit with regard to anti-imperialism and the war on poverty and the like, but you're seeing this as more of a border crossing or transnational movement. So can you talk a bit about how education movements on both the island and the mainland, how are they interacting? What's going on with these two groups?
So during the Cold War, education becomes a really important battleground to engage in Cold War era debates, not just about civil rights and equal opportunity in a domestic sense, but also about these big global questions of modernity and sovereignty. Specifically, what is the proper path to modern economic development? Is it US-style capitalism or Soviet-style communism or some sort of third-way socialism? And what does it mean to be sovereign in this superpower-dominated Cold War context in an age of decolonization? So educational spaces, like, for example, debates about curriculum or administration, financing, education's link to economic development, these really become sites for everyday citizens to engage these issues and not just policymakers or diplomats, and really shape those debates. And this happens on the island as well as the mainland. So on the island, what you see is really a massive government effort to expand the education system for the explicit purpose of capitalist modernization. And this is influenced by modernization theory and the idea of human capital theory coming from the Cold War University of the 1950s and 60s. And this idea of what you need in order to take off his trained workforce and managers for the island's new factories. And so this results in just the massive, rapid expansion of the public school system, the proliferation of literacy and adult education programs, the creation of a community education project, which really aimed to teach people to kind of be modern in this weird way. And education becomes what planners called the cornerstone of development in this era. And so you also see Commonwealth government using schools to promote cultural nationalism, as we were discussing, and their version of it, which leads to, for example, Spanish being the official language of the island for the first time in the late 1940s, and new curricular materials made by Puerto Ricans about Puerto Rico. And yet this also means that educational sites become, these really important spaces for island residents to engage and negotiate and critique these bootstrap policies, which they absolutely did.
Right.
And and the same goes for the diaspora on the mainland. And, your question was, how are these connected? And so, education becomes a key focus of activism for the post-war Puerto Rican Great Migration as well. And again, you see activists are engaging with this idea of, what is the best path toward modernity? And some Puerto Ricans answer with capitalism and the idea that you can pull yourselves up by your bootstraps. But others really critique that premise and argue for ed reform within maybe a broader socialist revolution or, some groups, even a communist revolution. Yeah, and you see Puerto Ricans focusing in New York on issues of community control, bilingual education, critiquing culture of poverty ideas as part of their drive for both modernity and sovereignty. And kind of this last part of this is really interesting. As I mentioned before, at the policymaking level, you also have people who had worked on programs in Cold War global development, like in Bootstrap or the Alliance for Progress, coming back to craft the domestic war and poverty programs. So you see a lot of links between the two, with the idea that what worked for former colonies and nations of color abroad might work for communities of color in the U.S. and the quote-unquote internal colonies. So you see links between international community development and domestic community action, for example. This idea of maximum feasible participation comes out of that. You see links between bilingual ed and even programs like the Peace Corps or Puerto Rico's Escuelas Maternales, which were preschools, come to influence the domestic teacher corps and Head Start in really interesting ways. And there's just a bunch of examples of that. So while education was kind of this, the right kind of revolution and safer capitalism abroad, this was also deeply linked to President Johnson's ideas about education being the only valid passport from poverty, which is his famous quote from the 1960s. And so, in this way, you do really see a transnational formulation of policy, of activism, grappling with these big questions. What is education's link to economic development? What does sovereignty look like in schools, but also in society? And how is education both a reflection of these debates and a tool to enter and shape them?
Who are some of the leaders that are making these critiques that are coming from the Puerto Rican community, either on the mainland or in Puerto Rico? Can you talk a bit more about those movement leaders or people who are involved in the process?
Yes, absolutely. So Puerto Rican community in New York and on the islands as well, but in New York has a really rich history of educational activism, particularly in the post-war period. So Antonia Pantoja, she becomes an extremely important figure. She starts the group Aspira, which becomes, sort of like a mainstream youth development organization within the quote-unquote bootstrap mold in the 1950s and early 60s, but also a really important training ground for more radical activists later. And Pantoja herself becomes kind of more radicalized by the late 60s and early 70s. So she's a really important figure. Evelina Lopez Antonetti started the United Bronx Parents, which was a really awesome parent-based, parent-run activist group out of the South Bronx. And so they were really influential in advocating for community control of schools in New York, bilingual, bicultural education, and a number of really important educational policies. Mm-hmm. So there's a lot. So I would say those two are kind of like the most important figures in this era. But then you just see a lot of parent organizing amongst the Puerto Rican community. You see the first Puerto Rican Board of Education president, who's sort of a more mainstream figure connected with island-based politics, but he still becomes president as decentralization is going on. Joseph Montserrat. And then the Puerto Rican Forum is a really important organization that's involved in these politics as well.
So with regard to the individuals, I was thinking a bit back on at least the early stages of your research. And you had mentioned quite a bit about high school students and their involvement in this process. Can you talk a bit more about the youth-led movements and how they were connected with this education movement as a larger scale?
Absolutely. So I think often we think about this global 60s activism as happening a lot on university campuses, but it's really important to think about how K through 12 students, particularly high school students, were just as involved in these movements and were really influential. So in all of the big protests and organizing for community control, bilingual, bicultural education, high school students were right there, and they were organizing, they were writing really influential kind of pamphlets and magazines connecting anti-imperial politics abroad to what was happening in their schools. And a lot of young lords were high school students, actually, and a lot of what was happening on university campuses was linked to high school students, even through Aspira clubs, which operated in high schools. And so often university students were encouraged to go back to their former high schools, and in that way, Aspira, UBP became really important links between K through 12 and higher ed organizing.
And were some of the students involved here in sort of I'm assuming they're in public schools, right? What was happening beyond the public schools with these students? Did they have any sort of side educational projects that they or their parents or some other local activists were involved in? Especially considering that I know you had mentioned that one of the activists was pushing for bilingual education, right? But not only it's not so much a question of bilingualism, but also a question of biculturalism or multiculturalism. Where did young people and or their parents or fellow activists, what were they doing to sort of encourage this beyond the public school system in New York?
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think we do really need to think about education as operating outside of the K through 12 system. And, it is also important to note that this activism was happening in some Catholic schools as well, which I think is an often forgotten about landscape of activist terrain in this era. But, there are really important kind of weekend liberation schools being set up by United Bronx Parents and the Young Lords and other activist organizations. And within these reading circles and other kind of like learning groups, they would promote cultural pride, history in a way that, isn't taught in the schools. So the Young Lords were really active in this, for example, of having sort of Puerto Rican educational classes and saying, the history that we've learned is really the legacy of colonialism, and we need to start, telling our own histories and writing our own histories. So here we see El Centro, which becomes a community archive for the diaspora, comes directly out of these activist movements of this era. So it becomes a space to produce research by the Puerto Rican community about themselves, when for so long they had been the subjects of research studies and everything, but not the active voices actually making those arguments.
So I'm a huge nerd, so I think that's really fascinating, right?
Oh, I love it, yeah.
I'm wondering, though, I know a bit about the surveillance of the Young Lords, but were the people who were involved exclusively with these educational projects, were they also surveyed by the U.S. government, and did they face any sort of state-based repression or issues, or were they sort of operating under the radar?
That's a good question. So I think something like Aspira, for example, could sort of operate. It was always a little bit more mainstream. They were, actively cooperating with city government. They had funding from a lot of the mainstream liberal foundations. Yet at the same time, a lot of their members, especially the high school students, could be more radical. And so I think in that way, a lot of people, operating in Aspira circles, they weren't, infiltrated by COINTELPRO, the FBI, like the Young Lords were. But there was such overlap between these organizations that a lot of people who are active in educational activism definitely faced, repression and surveillance by the FBI during this time.
Right. And especially thinking about just the overlap of leftist movements, right, that are
Exactly.
involved in this. It's almost inevitable. I'm curious a bit about that as well. So you mentioned that some of the leaders of these groups, or at least the groups themselves, were a little bit more centrist or mainstream. I'm just curious about, were there, to the best of your knowledge, were there any very radical left or Marxist aligned groups that were forming at this time on the mainland? I'm aware of them in a little bit in Puerto Rico, but on the mainland and in New York in particular, beyond the Young Lords, were there others who were more, I guess we would say nowadays, hard left focused, to your knowledge?
Yeah, I would say El Comité was a really important leftist organization, and their main goal was not educational activism, but as you mentioned, all these movements were aligned, and they were a really important one, arguing for definitely a more kind of, hard left Marxist interpretation of their social politics.
So thinking a bit now about the present, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, all of these movements, Young Lords, Black Panthers, a lot of the indigenous movements in the Americas are coming to the fore once again, especially as researchers are gaining access to these archives that have finally been opened up by the government, right? And discovering more and more. So I'm curious now about where your work fits in the present, particularly as we think about Puerto Rico and a lot of the university movements, austerity, a lot of developments that have happened with regard to the hurricane. If you could talk a bit about Puerto Rico in the present and where you see more contemporary movements fitting in with this larger set of research.
Yeah, so with my research, I really want people kind of working with educational movements for justice today to think about some parallels between the era that I'm working in. So just as within, the global 60s, both policymakers and grassroots activists are really being shaped by these global political dynamics. And, instead of maybe the modernization theory of the 1960s, it's really this neoliberal ideology that's being kind of encouraged and spread across borders all over the world by kind of these global development, quote unquote, experts, right? And so this definitely happened in Puerto Rico, specifically because of the mounting debt crisis that has been happening really for years now. And
wait, hold on. You mean the debt crisis didn't start with Trump?
I am glad you asked, because no, it definitely did not. And, I think it's really important to note that these movements, which I think people are turning to in Puerto Rico right now in the quote unquote age of Trump, have really been going on for a long time, because neoliberalism has been going on for a long time, right? Starting even in the 70s and 80s, but during, the Clinton, Bush, and Obama administrations, this has all been going on. And particularly, sadly, during the Obama administration, and the debt crisis in 2010 is when you saw a really big strike at the University of Puerto Rico in response to austerity measures that were being recommended by these hedge funds and sort of former IMF economists that, were recommending in order to deal with the debt crisis, you need to start decreasing your education budget, laying off teachers, closing and consolidating schools, and increasing tuition at the university. So this, really kicked off some really amazing leftist organizing on the island by university students, but also by teachers' unions, by a lot of different unions. And so for many years now, we've been having a really interesting engagement with neoliberal education reform, but neoliberal policies, across the board in Puerto Rico. And so in the wake of Hurricane Maria, when we're, kind of nervous about this disaster capitalism coming in after the hurricane, we do have to recognize it was already, trying to be implemented there pre-hurricane. And now, sadly, maybe the conditions are worse. But, there have been movements fighting against this. And so we're seeing some really exciting stuff happening in the island right now against neoliberal reforms, which is absolutely influencing what's happening on the mainland. And just like they did in the 60s, people cross borders, people talk, maybe even heightened now with social media. So what's happening in Puerto Rico is having, hopefully a really exciting effect on corporate education reform organizing in New York, but it was even before Hurricane Maria as well.
So I'm hoping that I don't forget what I want to ask you, but I have a back question that I do need to ask. I think one of the things that we sort of tend to start in the middle of things, right? We like to start with major controversies, but we don't really know the backstory. Could you talk a little bit more about how Puerto Rico got into debt? It seems that from what you mentioned early on in our discussion, when you were talking about how a lot of the businesses were pulling out and that was starting to create a type of deindustrialization in the 70s, is it linked to that? Is there more to this story, or is it something somewhat comparable to what we see in places like Detroit or St. Louis or Memphis? Are we seeing something that's more a result of deindustrialization, or is it a matter of Puerto Rico still being treated as a colony, or is it a mixture of both? Can you talk a little bit about the background of the debt crisis itself?
Yeah, I think it absolutely is a mixture of both, and I don't really think we can have an adequate understanding of the current debt crisis without understanding Puerto Rico's long history of being a colony and being sort of a tax haven, and then that not working out well, and then island leaders being kind of between a rock and a hard place and looking for solutions and not having many good options. And so, you do see these vulture funds, which we've seen at work, in Argentina and in Greece and other places around the world, come in sort of in this, in the past 10, 15 years. But, you can't quite understand that without understanding Puerto Rico's colonial past. And it is important to recognize the mismanagement by Puerto Rican politicians, during this era. But I think that's also an interesting parallel to the ways that Puerto Rican colonial elites in the post-war period had to negotiate their position and, may have, quote unquote, sold out, to the imperialists pretty much. But the way in which colonial politics for a long time have shaped the available options on the island, you absolutely have to take that into consideration.
Right. So thank you for that. That's That's really important, because I think, again, we don't have, in the U.S., at least in the mainland, in the news, we just kind of start in the middle of things. We don't have a full backstory, and then we have 5 seconds to try to figure that backstory out before we've moved on to something else, right?
Exactly.
So it's super important to get that story. What I was going to ask, though, more with regard to your specific response before explaining the crisis, is you mentioned that there were movements going on in around the 2010, 2011, up to the hurricane. And I'm wondering now, seemingly with a lot of these activists and their families displaced, are these movements going to continue, you think, in the mainland? And what will that look like for Puerto Rico going forward?
That's a really interesting question. And I think on one hand, there is kind of this hope on behalf of mainland social movements that, a lot of Puerto Ricans coming to the mainland have exciting, experience working against these neoliberal reforms, have really good organizing experience. They might reinvigorate our social and labor movements. And on one hand, that is really exciting, and I think that can definitely happen. And on the other, I think we do have to, realize the real human toll that's taking on families, and that, I think it will have a negative impact on what's happening on the island. I mean, just so many people are having to leave. People are having to deal with just kind of, basic get food and water and shelter and stuff like that. And so it'll be curious what happens on the island. But I do hope that, the movements as they have for a long time stay really connected, but that in sort of our excitement of like, oh, hey, Puerto Ricans moved to swing states and vote left, we don't get too excited about that without thinking about, what's happening to the island, because that is still very important as well. And do these families, do they want to come here just, for those reasons, but maybe they want to stay at home and have, continued progressive politics there as well. So.
No, I think that's a really important point. And I recall a tweet to an effect of basically saying that, yay, we're going to get more Democratic voters, which is a little bit insensitive, to say the least. But I do think it is important to think about perhaps not even just the movements that were happening before the hurricane, but also the movements that are still ongoing after the hurricane, right? And the way that a lot of people have really come together and used this as a point of galvanizing, and really forcing a lot of Puerto Ricans to rethink their relationship with the United States, whether or not a lot of these programs of austerity were really the right way to go. Because I don't expect so much from U.S. Americans in the mainland, at least in the government, especially right now, to really start asking those questions. But I do think that there's a lot of potential on the island in terms of these movements that could spring up as well in the present, right?
Absolutely.
And I'm curious about your, you mentioned that your research again is really questioning the role of anti-imperial movements and sort of global outlooks on independence of sorts, if not literal independence, but at least some sense of political independence to some degree. I'm curious about where you now see Puerto Rico's place politically, right, going forward.
Yeah.
Is there hope, I guess, is the question, right? Does Puerto Rico have any options at this point to even recover? Do these movements have an option to restart? And what does it look like, especially now that obviously Trump is hardly helpful, if at all? Yeah. So where do you see Puerto Rican leftist movements or social movements going from now, and the island itself?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a really hard one to answer, but one that I do get a lot studying Puerto Rico, and particularly about status. A lot of people ask, what is the best thing, statehood or independence or remaining a commonwealth? And, beyond, that is Puerto Ricans' decision to make. I think it's really hard to answer given this colonial history. I think in a perfect world, we could say absolutely independence today, but without, a really thoughtful sort of transition to independence with reparations from the United States that could leave a lot of Puerto Ricans, in really tough material situations. Right. And so on the left, there continue to be really important movements for independence, which are growing in the wake of the hurricane, as you mentioned. I mean, the mayor of San Juan, who's been getting a lot of press lately, Carmen Yulín Cruz, is part of the really big and long pro-Commonwealth party. But in the wake of this, she's really starting to publicly question the political relationship with the United States and is calling more overtly for independence, which is kind of interesting. But a lot more people are. But at the same time, you have leftist movements saying, well, maybe we should become a state, which has actually historically been a more conservative position on the island. But let's do it from a left perspective and ally ourselves with progressive movements of color on the mainland. And maybe that's our best path forward. And so it's really tricky. Again, this is an issue that Puerto Ricans, should have the sovereignty and the ability to decide for themselves. And they're very split as a community, understandably, because it's just a really tough decision. But as a left movement, I think we need to, really think about what is the best pathway forward for Puerto Ricans, both on the island and mainland.
So it's interesting that you brought up Carmen Yulín Cruz, because obviously she's been the center of a lot of, by way of Trump, right, who's been antagonizing her pretty much from the jump, simply for disagreeing with him on his methods of quote-unquote outreach to the island, which has been pretty paltry and offensive at best.
The paper towels.
Right, yeah. Oh my God, it was bad. It's been bad. Yeah. But what's fascinating is they don't really talk about her politics, right? She's been the adversary on the island against Trump, and I think everything's centered around Trump. But it's really fascinating what you brought up about her leaning towards independence and how the hurricane and her relationship with the mainland governance has really pushed her a little bit to an area where she perhaps hadn't thought of in the past. Have there been similar movements of other members of her party or other politicians on the island, perhaps, who have started now to push more for independence?
Yeah, and I think this is another really interesting parallel between, the 1960s and early 70s as well. So a lot of people who supported the Commonwealth, or even in the party that created it, start to become more disillusioned as, the effects of this relationship really comes to a fore. It happened in the 70s when all the factories moved back to the mainland and people were left unemployed. And it's happening again. So I do think you see more people, who are in the Partido Popular Democrático, which is kind of the pro-Commonwealth Party, becoming more independentista, which, historically has actually been a pretty small movement on the island, for many reasons, including repression.
Right.
But, I think there has also been a longstanding, we can be nationalist within the Commonwealth political setup. And I think a lot more people are questioning that in the wake of this. And the relatively small Puerto Rican Independence Party, I think you're seeing more people look towards them for some answers as well.
And speaking again of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the mainland government, I was thinking a bit again about education, right? So I've seen some things floating around, some universities saying that they're going to extend scholarships specifically for Puerto Rican students who are affected by the hurricane, or, incoming college students to research or do work outside of Puerto Rico. Do you have any connection or understanding of what that looks like on the ground? Are there more active movements beyond just a few universities here and there in the U.S. who are reaching out to university or even high school students so that they can continue their education, even if they have to be physically away from Puerto Rico?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I wish I knew of a united movement. As far as I know right now, it is really happening on this sort of one-off basis. So certain universities, or more so certain school districts, are saying, let's come up with a plan. So certain school districts in New York, or maybe around Philadelphia, or in Florida, definitely, they're saying, yes, let's come up with a plan for our new Puerto Rican students. Let's provide them with some extra support services. And that's happening in really exciting ways, but kind of by the nature of the extremely localized school system in the United States,
right.
It is sort of happening on this really decentralized level. And same with universities, I'd say. But, you're also seeing Puerto Rican organizations advocating for, more scholarships or kind of semesters at certain universities for Puerto Rican students who are displaced, which is, I think, a really positive thing.
Right. It's definitely it's heartening, I guess you could say, that people are moving in this direction. I worry at the same time in the back of my head because I know that certain groups' intentions are not in any way altruistic, right?
Right.
And I worry sometimes that this hurricane will then further increase dependency or this sort of colonial relationship with the U.S. always in control, right? And you had mentioned, and many others have spoken about, some of the energy or the plans to reintroduce energy and electricity in Puerto Rico, for example. We've seen a lot of these weird, catch and go attempts to reestablish lighting and power and internet, cell phone service and the like, beyond the rather failed attempt by Zinke, I believe, and Trump. Do you know of any other, even if perhaps extra governmental movements to help restore resources in Puerto Rico?
So as you mentioned, there was a really unfortunate instance of mismanagement by the Puerto Rican Energy Company right after the hurricane. And that's its own whole shady story involving Zinke and a Montana-based company. But there have also been groups attempting to create a more sustainable energy grid in the wake of the island's infrastructure being wiped out. So anticipating that private companies and these shock doctrinists were going to want to come in and privatize the electrical system, we're seeing grassroots groups like Resilient Puerto Rico offering alternative energy solutions based on solar power, for example. And the hope is that these efforts aren't just temporary, but they'll be an enduring part of the rebuilding efforts. And all of these efforts have really been part of a broader movement for not simply a recovery after the hurricane, but a just recovery, which would mean something a lot broader. And it means creating an environmentally sustainable, more sovereign, more democratic political system. It would mean eliminating the Jones Act, which is this colonial maritime law that jacks up prices of any imports and keeps the island in poverty and in debt. And it would mean advocating for a debt cancellation because, as we were discussing, Puerto Rico as a colony, it can't just declare bankruptcy like Detroit or Washington, D.C. as a city. And it advocates for a citizen audit of the debt instead of the current Fiscal Control Board, or Junta Fiscal, which was this unappointed, undemocratic kind of oversight board that was appointed in 2016 to manage financial decisions on the island. It only has 2 or 3 Puerto Ricans on that board, and this has clear imperial overtones. So we're seeing movements to advocate for more participatory democracy, and this is, translating to other resources as well, obviously.
So wait, I'm sorry. Let me just interrupt you really fast. Is this board that you're talking about actually part of Promesa? Was this the board that was established by way of that bill?
Exactly.
Okay.
So in 2016, Promesa establishes the Junta Fiscal, and they do have power right now on the island to make financial decisions.
Okay. Thank you. Keep going about that. I'm sorry. I just wanted to make sure that we're talking about or thinking about the same legislation, right? So that's great to know.
Exactly. And this has been happening because Promesa and the Junta Fiscal is encouraging austerity in other realms. It's really getting people thinking about other resources in addition to energy, like education, but also food and sustainable agriculture, and thinking about how to create food sovereignty. And that takes the form of, right now, in the wake of the hurricane, there's a lot of mutual kitchens and mutual kind of communal kitchens being set up. There's also efforts to collect seeds and replant and start setting up a lot of community agricultural systems to sort of weaken the dependency on imports from mainland food sources in the wake of this. So a lot of those are really, really exciting ways to sort of combat what could be just coming in and implementing a lot of privatizing shock doctrine policies in the wake of this hurricane.
So switching gears a bit, I heard from a little birdie that you're working on a book. Is that correct? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. So it is a book that's kind of unrelated, but kind of not, actually, about the recent history of teacher education in the United States. So our question is kind of, if you wanted to become a teacher in 1980, you had to go to a school of education. Within, 30 years, there's all these varieties of pathways to certification and entry into the classroom. So, Teach for America is the most probably visible and well-known example of that, but there's just been a proliferation of alternative certification and hybrid programs. So we're taking a historical approach to that question, and looking at that.
And this alternative approach, right, does this involve expanding opportunities perhaps for communities of color or lower income people who perhaps don't have the means to be credentialed in a traditional way?
Yeah, so that's one of these really interesting questions we get at in the book. So, if you're coming from a left perspective, often you see these alternative certifications, and, rightly so, as part of the neoliberal reform agenda of bringing a lot of, maybe wealthy, white, upper class, young students into classrooms and displacing teachers of color. But at the same time, what we get into, it's really important to recognize the critiques that were coming from communities of color in the 60s and 70s, saying that how we certify teachers now is also creating, a largely, white upper middle class teaching force for a school system that's now, majority students of color. And so, we kind of look at intersections between these more radical left critiques of education schools, as well as the more neoliberal, Milton Friedman-esque kind of reform critiques as well, and how they, sometimes coincided to create alternative certification programs, but, dismissing some of the critiques and ideas of radical leftists from the 60s.
Right.
But at the same time, I think it's interesting, if you look at the numbers, a lot of alternative certification programs are bringing a lot more teachers of color into school districts than education schools are. So we're really encouraging education schools, sort of the establishment, quote unquote, which we see actually as more of like a progressive bastion, right? In what ways has that establishment failed as well to bring teachers of color into communities and train them well? So, I think what we kind of end up advocating for is, how can we, adequately train educators and prepare them with a professional education that, both prepares them and doesn't, cripple unions,
Right.
But also really, increase diversity within our country schools.
Right. I mean, that introduces a lot of really fascinating questions, particularly as sort of if we think about these blind spots that we have in more progressive circles, right? In particular with regard to access to learning to become an educator, right? Access to higher education, access to a lot of things. And I think it sort of pokes holes in some of the discussions, or at least very bifurcated discussions that we've seen with regard to charter schools and school choice and the like. There's always an underside to this that complicates our discussions, and I think it's worth really digging in a little bit deeper and understanding all sides of it.
Yep.
Do you all talk about charter schools at all in your work?
We do a little bit, in the sense that charter schools are one of the main employers of alternatively certified teachers. But it does sort of intersect again where you see kind of in the early years of charter schools, a lot of communities of color that were really, highly critical of the education establishment through education schools and the public education system, seeing them as sort of hopeful, as places of self-determination, actually, in a lot of independent schools, start in the 60s and 70s based on these ideas. And then you see them sort of co-opted by the ed reform establishment, which is not community-based at all.
Right. Well, I look forward to reading it when it comes out. You'll have a title yet?
Yes. So it's Teaching Teachers, Changing Paths and Enduring Debates. And I'm actually co-authoring that with Professor James Fraser at NYU, who's worked a lot on the history of teacher education. And it's set to be published in the fall of 2018, so next year, with the Johns Hopkins University Press.
Awesome. Well, I look forward to reading it and promoting it.
Thank you.
So just wrapping up a bit, do you have any last words for us, things that we should think about with regard to Puerto Rico, with regard to education, with regard to these movements? Any last thoughts that you'd like to impart upon the listeners?
Yeah, well, I would say there's a lot to say, but if I'm limiting, I will encourage people working for educational justice today to really, think about what your podcast is aiming to do, and think about movements on the left from communities of color throughout history, and even recently, and what arguments they've been making all along. So I think you have a lot of people who are really against this ed reform movement today. And if we look to movements that have been happening in Latin America for the past few decades against neoliberal education policies, which have been implemented there, for decades, there are a lot of really interesting lessons, a lot of really interesting opportunities for solidarity with movements across the hemisphere and across the world, really, and really let those voices lead.
Yeah. Well, I always say, I have a little phrase where I always say, don't sleep on the South, but I'm normally thinking about the South of the United States, right? Because there's a lot of radicalism happening in the South that people up north and beyond sort of ignore, right? But I think in this case, when I say don't sleep on the South, we've got to think about South America, the Caribbean, the global South, right? And I think that really does offer a lot for us to learn from as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Wendy. Thanks for having me.
Amados hermanos, compañeros y compañeras, ustedes saben y ustedes reconocen que son puertorriqueños, ¿verdad? ¿Verdad? Ahora vamos a enseñarle a esta gente ahora que nosotros nunca los olvidamos que somos boricuas.
And that was episode 3 of the Left Pocket Project podcast. To learn more about Lauren's research, you can follow her on Twitter at Lauren Lefty, and that's LaurenLefty. And of course, to see more about what's going on at the Left Pocket Project, you can follow me at LeftPOC, and that's LeftPOC. And as always, you can follow us on Facebook at LeftPOC, or show your support on Patreon, and that's at patreon.com/LeftPOC. Thanks so much for listening. Have a good one.
Mira para allá, música criolla, boricua. Ahora tengo ganas de comerme un buen plato de arroz y habichuela. Ay, bonito, me encanta la música puertorriqueña. Me encanta. Ahora mismo estoy pensando en esa isla tan bonita, las palmas de coco, el yunque, ay, y el mar, y las mujeres, ay, Dios, tan bonitas que son esas criaturas. Que el Señor bendiga eso. Ay, le doy gracias, Señor. Le doy gracias que soy puertorriqueño.